No sé. A ver. Oh, súper reciente. Introduction. Entonces el prefacio es el que no se lee, ¿cierto? Ya. Entonces. Está modificado el índice. Está simplificado a cagar. Research into the this and the meaning. Ya. Oye, ábrete el Stern también, porque para los resúmenes. Yo creo que apaña. Ya. Excelente, empezamos. Entonces, no pongáis números romanos, pues si vamos a hacer como 40.000 de estas weas. Sí. Ponerle capítulo. Y hagamos el speedrun de esta wea. Después. There is introduction. No puedo hablar tan rápido. Fracasamos. No, fracasamos. Ya. No, después hacemos el speedrun. Sí. Ya. Entonces, la introducción del editor, sí, pues leámosla. De todas maneras, ¿cierto? Ya. It has been said that the difference between Nietzsche and Hegel is that we can understand Nietzsche's individual is that we can understand Nietzsche. Punto. Nietzsche's individual sentences, but not what he's saying overall. Whereas with Hegel it is the other way around. We can understand what he's saying overall, but not his individual sentences. Cállense. This dictum is over-optimistic as far as the phenomenology of a spirit is concerned. Not only are its individual sentences often obscure, if not impenetrable, it is far from clear what the book is about overall. Toma. The problems begin with the title. In conformity with its derivation from the Greek words phainomai, appear, and logos, count, reason, etc. Phenomenology means study of appearances, or appearances, but appearance is ambiguous. It may mean the emergence or manifestation of something. Hegel's book appeared in 1807, for example. His honesty was quite apparent, or it may mean the way something seems in contrast to the way it really is. Hegel's book appears to solve all philosophical problems. His honesty was only apparent. Hegel uses appearance, Erscheinung, as the verb to appear, erscheinen, in both ways. No lo abrí 2 veces, espera. ¿En qué página está la nota? ¿Estás seguro que ahí empieza? ¿No es de la fenomenología? ¿Mm? Ah, verdad, chucha, yo tampoco caché, weón. Lo tenía. Ya, nota 1. When an ordinary writer uses a word that is assigned more than one meaning in the dictionary, we normally assume that he or she is using it in only one of these meanings. But Hegel is not an ordinary writer, and he often has in mind more than one meaning of a word when he uses it. His intention is to unearth deep and significant connections between seemingly disparate concepts. A striking example of this procedure is his use of Aufheben, sublate, in all its senses at once, elevate, destroy, and preserve, that is, kick upstairs. What? Ya, entonces sigue. What appears is Geist. Geist is the usual German word for the intellectual aspect. What appears is Geist. Geist is the usual German word for the intellectual aspect of an individual, the mind, but in the phenomenology it more commonly refers to the collective mind or a spirit shared by a group of people. It is as Hegel memorably puts it, I that is we and we that is I. It can also refer to the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, and this religious connotation is never far from Hegel's mind when he uses the word Geist. Yeah, the Spirit appears on the scene as in the course of the phenomenology, but it does not appear all at once, as does, say, a book or a person on my doorstep. It rather presents aspects of itself, fragmentary appearances in which fully fledged the spirit is not revealed as a whole, but can be seen in retrospect as the source from which they stem. In search of the absolute. To learn more about the subject matter of Hegel's book, we need to turn not to the long preface with which it begins, but the shorter introduction that follows it. The preface was written after Hegel had completed the rest of the book and was meant as an introduction not only to the phenomenology, but to the whole philosophical system to which the phenomenology was originally intended as an introduction. The preface is thus more closely connected with the concluding paragraphs of the book, which present the whole system in outline, than it is with the earlier stages of the work. Nota 2. Strictly speaking, the preface should be read at the end of the book rather than at the beginning. In his commentary, Quentin Lowe adopts this order, leaving the preface until last. Continúa el texto, el cuerpo del texto. The introduction raises a problem to which the phenomenology Se me corrió. Yeah, the introduction raises a problem to which the phenomenology purports to provide an answer, namely, can we know the absolute, and if so, how? The problem arose with particular poignancy in the wake of Kant's critique of pure reason, which had argued that we cannot know things in themselves, rock-bottom reality, but only things as they appear to us. It is tempting to paraphrase the absolute as mind-independent reality. No doubt the absolute would be independent of minds if there were no minds. But since there are minds and the absolute is responsible for them, minds cannot be independent of the absolute, and conversely, the absolute cannot be entirely independent of minds. Moreover, in Hegel's view, there necessarily are minds, since the absolute must be known by minds. He never considers the possibility that there might have been no human minds. ¡Qué chucha! ¡Qué chucha, weón! Palpico la wea loca, hermano. ¡Qué wea este loco, weón! ¡Qué mierda! ¿Qué wea se fumó este weón? ¿Qué wea, weón? Ya. Traditionally, continúa el cuerpo del texto. Traditionally, the realm of things in themselves had been supposed to be populated by various supernatural entities, God or gods. And one of the motives of Kant's transcendental idealism was to leave a space open for such entities. Oye, más respeto, weón. ¿Qué weón te pasa? Oh, el weón. Fuera de mi ruca. ¿No respetáis lo religioso? Ya, fuera. Ah, tú eres nietzscheano. Y... ¿Qué pasó? ¿Y ahora? Chucha. Tú soy nietzscheano. Te cachamos. Chal, weón. Puta el weón. Ya. No hay que hacerlo, pues weón. Sigamos. Puta el weón, desagradable ya. Kant argues, for example, that if we believe that God and his knowledge of the world are atemporal, then we must regard time as ideal and not as a feature of rock-bottom reality. If we believe that God and his knowledge of the world are atemporal, then we must regard time as ideal and not as a feature of rock-bottom reality. Religious belief is, however, a matter not of knowledge but of faith. A faith that is required if, as Kant did, we take morality seriously. Yeah. Sibo, Kant, for Hegel's criticism of this, see his account of the moral worldview in the Phenomenology. According to Hegel, such a skepticism about our knowledge of the absolute presupposes that our cognitive equipment is like an instrument or medium, or as we might anachronistically say, a camera, which may distort our pictures of the absolute. There is no way in which we could, by inspecting the pictures of such a global camera and comparing them with reality, discover the distortion it introduces and make allowance for it. It I cannot step outside my own consciousness to survey and assess it from an external standpoint. No more can I, Hegel believes, step outside my own ethical order in order to assess it from a neutral standpoint. Claro. C, where they attempt to establish laws for one society or to test the laws that are already in place, is implicitly criticized. Ah, claro, sí, paragraph 437, where blah 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 is the attempt to establish the laws for one society or to test the laws that are already in place is implicitly criticized for its pretension to occupying an Archimedean point outside one's society. Ay, que es conservador, weón. Ya sigamos. However, the camera model of cognition is defective in several respects. First, it postulates a rift between myself and my cognitive equipment, between the photographer and the camera, but the photographer cannot be wholly denuded of primary cognitive equipment independent of the camera. I have, after all, to inspect the pictures supplied by my camera and to ask whether they are veridical or not. If I cannot rely on this primary equipment, more intimately connected with myself than the other, I have no basis for raising skeptical doubts about the reliability of my secondary cognitive equipment. Oh, la wea. Tengo que leer esto, ¿no? ¿Es despojado? Ok. Desnudado. The photographer cannot be wholly denuded of primary cognitive equipment independent of the camera. De nuevo, arriba. Pero, men. Segundo párrafo. Está entero perdido. Segundo párrafo de la página 8. Del PDF. However, the camera model of cognition is defective in several respects. First, it postulates a rift between myself and my cognitive equipment, between the photographer and the camera. But the photographer cannot be wholly denuded of primary cognitive equipment, independent of the camera. I have, after all, to inspect the pictures supplied by my camera and to ask whether they are veridical or not. If I cannot rely on this primary equipment, more intimately connected with myself than the other, I have no basis for raising skeptical doubts about the reliability of my secondary cognitive equipment. This primary Comparar con Hume, 1975. Blah blah blah. There is a species of skepticism antecedent to all study and philosophy. It recommends an universal doubt, not only of our former opinions and principles, but also of our very faculties, of whose veracity they say we must assure ourselves by a chain of reasoning deduced from the original principle, from some original principle, which cannot possibly be fallacious or deceitful, but neither is there any such original principle, which has a prerogative above others, that are self-evident and convincing, or if there were, could we advance a step beyond it, but by the use of those very faculties of which we are supposed to be already diffident. Diffident, tímido. Me perdí ahí. Neither is there any such original principle which has a prerogative above others that are self-evident and convincing, or if there were, could we advance a step beyond it, but by the use of those very faculties of which we are supposed to be already diffident. Ah, sí. Qué buena. Rígido el guión, weón. Es como que chucha, weón. Es como verdad, es como razonable la objeción, pues, weón. Interesante. Entonces, sigo. En el cuerpo. Mire, llegamos a 3 personas. Muy bien. Entonces, sigamos. I also need this primary equipment to have knowledge of myself, including the camera model of my own cognition. Unless we suppose, as Kant in effect did, that I take unreliable selfies with my secondary equipment. An adequate account of the self must explain my ability to give that account. Here we have in effect two selves, one that has a view of the world and another that has a reliable view, not of the world itself, here we have in effect one that has a view of the world and another that has a reliable view, not of the world itself, but of that view of the world, and raises skeptical doubts about it. But there are further steps in. For secondly, the camera model neglects the fact that. ¿Aló? Oh, quizá está cagando, weón. Mal. Chucha. Yeah, but there are further selves in play too. For secondly, the camera model neglects the fact that I am only one among many similar selves, and that my knowledge of the world would be intolerably impoverished if I could not supplement my own meager first-hand experience of it with the testimony of other selves who perceive parts of the world that I do not, and from viewpoints that I do not occupy. How does the camera model accommodate other selves? Does it lapse into solipsism, regarding other not as selves on par with myself, but simply as entities recorded by my camera? Or does each of us have a camera of our own? Or do we all view the world through a single global camera? Each of these alternatives involves difficulties that had not been squarely confronted by Kant, who distinguished between myself and others, between I and we, only in his ethical writings, but not in his theoretical philosophy. No sé, weón. Puede ser. No sé, weón. Bishop Berkeley. No sé, weón. Bishop Berkeley, by contrast, assigned to minds, including minds. Ahora, Bishop Berkeley, by contrast, assigned to minds, including minds other than one's own, a more solid ontological status than that of material objects. The being of material things is simply to be perceived, both by us and by God, but the being of a mind consists in perceiving. Though we depend on God for our existence, we are not simply ideas in the mind of God. However, this conflicts with his empiricist arguments for his overall doctrine, some of which, such as his arguments that I cannot imagine a tree that is not perceived by me, tend towards solipsism. Vaya. Vaya, vaya. Hegel, by contrast, is vividly aware of the distinction between oneself and others, and seems to repair this deficiency in Kant. Other selves play at least two roles in Hegel's enterprise. First, they figure within some, if not all, of the shapes of consciousness that Hegel goes on to consider, most vividly in his account of self-consciousness in chapter 4. Nota 7. It must be admitted, however, that the distinction becomes salient in political and ethical contexts of the work, beginning with chapter 4 on conscious self-consciousness, and is relatively subdued on a more theoretical part of the work, such as chapters 1 to 3 on consciousness and chapter 5. Espera un poco. ¿Sigamos? Secondly, they are responsible for pressing a skeptical problem that Hegel attempts to overcome in the Phenomenology. If others hold a view different from my own, or from science, how can I settle the dispute in my own favor without begging the question? Yeah. This problem is examined by Foster. Hegel's solution to it, roughly speaking, to take his opponents on board and incorporate a modified version of their views into his own. Past philosophies and past shapes of consciousness are not simply rejected, but are sublated or kicked upstairs. Truth in them is integrated into their successors, especially into Hegel's own, quotes-unquote, science. Thirdly, the camera model differentiates the self in its camera from the absolute itself. How can that be? If the absolute is genuinely absolute, it cannot be sheerly distinct from selves, with their cameras and photographs. If it were, there would be two absolutes mysteriously disconnected from each other, since selves and their pictures undoubtedly exist. They cannot, or at least I cannot, be yet one more illusory appearance. The selves, their cameras and photographs must rather be offshoots of the absolute, sent down by the absolute itself. Vástago, offshoot. ¿Y ahora? The selves, their cameras and photographs must rather be offshoots of the Absolute, sent down by the Absolute itself. It is open to dispute whether Hegel believed in such a thing as the Absolute. But what is not in dispute is that he did not believe in an Absolute that is separate from human knowers. Any Absolute worthy of its name must encompass and account for the minds that, however imperfectly, know the Absolute. And the onward advance of the phenomenology is in large part driven by the quest for a type of knowledge that incorporates the knower in what is known. No sé, bueno. This is a problem faced not only by an idealist such as Hegel, but also by a materialist. Insofar as a materialist regards matter or energy as the absolute, she must treat matter not as simply contrasting with mind, but as able to accommodate and account for minds along with everything else. ¿Qué página estamos? Me corrí sin querer. Ah, sí, no me corrí con la otra. Hegel's response. Despite these deficiencies in the camera model in terms of which the problem of the absolute is posed, the problem still remains. The derivation of our concepts and beliefs from the absolute itself does not entail that they are appropriate or true. Illusions and error, as well as truths, must stem from the absolute. How can we know which, if any, of our beliefs about ultimate reality are truth and which are false? Hegel proposes the following solution. We should consider not directly the Absolute itself, but the series of forms of shapes or of consciousness that have occurred in our attempts to grasp the Absolute. Shape translates Gestalt throughout. It is tempting and perhaps closer to Hegel's meaning to translate Gestalt as form, but this is excluded by the fact that in other contexts Hegel also uses the word form, a near synonym of Gestalt, but not exact synonym. Each shape of consciousness apart from the last science itself, Hegel's own system, falls short of the truth, but Hegel's strategy is to advance towards the truth by using errors as stepping stones. Pero si hay que ver el... Oh, el buen mañoso. The word science, Wissenschaft, is used more widely in German than in English. What we would call art history, for example, is in German art science, Kunstwissenschaft. Whenever Hegel speaks of science, in the phenomenology, however, he means the ideal philosophy. That is, the philosophy that he aspires to develop. Each shape of consciousness, apart from the last science itself, Hegel's own system, falls short of the truth, but Hegel's strategy is to advance towards the truth by using errors as stepping stones, not to avoid error at all costs, as Descartes attempted to do. These errors are, for Hegel, never sheer errors, but always contain a grain or more of truth. We begin with the simplest shape, the immediate sensory awareness of individual entities. This collapses, but not because Hegel criticizes it. That would allow Hegel's opponents to claim that he rejects sensory certainty only because of its failure to satisfy a criterion that he chooses to apply to it, a criterion that sensory certainty itself might not acknowledge. Sensory certainty collapses because it fails to meet a criterion that it itself endorses and applies to itself. Sensory certainty can do this because, as Hegel says in paragraph 85, consciousness is on the one hand consciousness of the object, on the other hand consciousness of itself, consciousness of what it is to be the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the true. Since both are for consciousness, consciousness itself is their comparison. It becomes a matter for consciousness whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. The sense-certain conscious becomes aware of a conflict between what its objects purport to be, pure individuals, and its own way of getting to know them by the use of universal terms such as this, here, and now, terms which therefore in Hegel's view capture only universals, not the individuals they aimed for. For the debris of sensory certainty there emerges a new shape of consciousness, perception of things with properties. Hegel himself purports to play no more part in its emergence than he did in the assessment of its predecessor. This new object of consciousness is, he tells us in paragraph 87, the knowledge of the first object. That is, sensory certainty's illicit universal knowledge of its individual objects becomes of the object of the next shape of consciousness. The thing with its universal properties. In Hegel's view, any given shape necessarily has an immediate successor. And necessarily has the immediate successor it does have, the knowledge of its object acquired by shape of consciousness n becomes the object of shape of consciousness n by plus 1. Hegel himself plays no part in deciding how the sequence is to proceed. His role is simply that of an onlooker. He does, however, see things that the shapes of consciousness themselves do not. Hegel, or we, can see that and how perception emerged from sensory certainty, but neither of these shapes can see this. See paragraph 87. If we knew as much as Hegel knows, they would have the conceptual resources of Hegel, and would amount to absolute knowledge itself rather than simply rungs on the ladder towards it. Perception, in turn, undergoes a fate similar to that of sensory certainty. After that, there is a more abrupt transition. Perception in turn undergoes a fate similar to that of sensory certainty, and is likewise supplanted by another shape, understanding and force. After that, there is a more abrupt transition, less easy to comprehend than the previous two, and seemingly less conformable to the strategy Hegel outlines in the introduction. This is a transition from consciousness in chapters 1 to 3 to self-consciousness in chapter 4, which is not only a different shape, Gestalt, but also a new configuration, Gestaltung, grouping together several related shapes, in contrast to those of the first configuration in chapters 1 to 3. In the introduction, in paragraph 78, Hegel seems to use Gestaltung in the same way as Gestalt, but later in the work he uses it to refer to larger groups of related shapes. Encontré subrayado en el PDF. Ah, ya. ¿Aló? ¿Suena muy fuerte? Oh, qué mal, weón. Puta, voy a tener que comprarme otro. Mala. ¿Cuál te compraste tú? ¿Cuánto costaba? Ay, caleta. ¿Y se conecta con el regular? ¿Cómo se conecta de USB? Ya mandé, voy a buscar agua. ¿Aló? Estamos. Mhm. Oh, oh, chucha. Ya. Entonces, unlike the first, unlike the first three shapes, which have no obvious historical setting, but only a logical order, the shapes falling under the heading of self-consciousness form a rough historical sequence. The struggle for recognition and ensuing enslavement remind us of the ancient world, or perhaps of the state of nature. Stoicism and skepticism were developed in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, while unhappy consciousness recalls early Christianity. Now all four shapes occasionally resurface in the subsequent and historically later shapes of consciousness. Reason, in chapter 5, forms another configuration, but is divided into three sections: theoretical, practical, and a combination of the two. Theoretical or observing reason may be good enough for dealing with inorganic and organic nature, but it flounders when it comes to the human self. Cha, fuerte, pero un poco. Sí, es complicado, pero un poquito. Mañana. Mmm, qué loco. Entonces, eso, to deal with the self, reason needs to become practical. Neither reason nor its subsections have any specific historical occasion. History begins in earnest with Geist in chapter 6, which ranges from the Greek city-state, or as portrayed in Greek tragedy, down to the revolution in France and contemporaneous development of individualistic morality in Germany. The spirit gathers up the preceding shapes of consciousness and represents their emergence in history. See, for example, paragraphs 295, page 440, blah blah blah. Finally, religion in chapter 7 introduces a new historical sequence, which begins with Zoroastrianism, cum Judaism. Me equivoqué. No, se dice cum. En latín. Sonó raro. Finally, religion in chapter 7 introduces a new historical sequence which begins with Zoroastrianism, cum Judaism. See paragraph 7, 420, and ends with Lutheranism on the brink of its transformation into Hegelian philosophy. In his final chapter 8, Hegel stresses the unfolding of the shapes of consciousness in history. But this series of shapes in the phenomenology corresponds to no single temporal sequence. Their ordering is primarily logical, and only occasionally does the logical order mesh with a historical order. Hegel believes that the process whereby each shape of consciousness generates its immediate successor, that each shape's knowledge of its object, becomes the object of the next shape, guarantees the completeness of the shapes of consciousness he presents. See paragraph 79. This is somewhat over-optimistic, but both because it is not obvious that the process in question does ensure completeness. After all, the process whereby numbers are generated by beginning with 0 and continually applying the operation +1 doesn't capture all the numbers there are, and because Hegel's application of the procedure becomes more perfunctory, or at least less exportable, as the phenomenology proceeds. Perfunctory español, a ver. Superficial. But even if the process that Hegel applied, or rather considered, in his view of his non-interventionist stance, were guaranteed to omit no shape of consciousness, it would not follow that consciousness of the Absolute itself was to be found among them. For even if the Absolute itself is ultimately accessible to human consciousness, there is little reason to suppose that our quest for it will ever come up to an end and not continue indefinitely, as a number generation does, turning up new shapes of consciousness that Hegel never liked to consider. Human consciousness. In a sense, Hegel himself accepts that the Absolute is not accessible to human consciousness, since he believes that insofar as there is an Absolute at all, it is the pure thoughts of his logic which form the scaffolding both of nature and of the mind. Andamiaje. When one thinks about, and in terms of, his thoughts, one is not conscious in Hegel's sense, since the thoughts are not an object distinct from oneself. Hermano. No sé, men. No sé, weón. The Absolute Unmasked. No, nota 14. Puta el culiao, weón. For even if the absolute itself is ultimately accessible to human consciousness, there's little reason to suppose that our quest for it will ever come to an end and not continue indefinitely as number generation does, turning up new shapes of consciousness that Hegel never lived to consider. Nota 14. Steckler argues, reasonably enough, that humanity's quest for truth is never ending, as his attribution of this view to Hegel is more controversial. The absolute unmasked. Here we need to ask, does Hegel answer or even attempt to answer the question about the absolute? In the introduction, he seems to have dismissed the question along with its presuppositions, and to have turned to a quite different subject, our successive views of the absolute. How could an account of our views of the absolute tell us anything about the absolute itself? Our successive diverse views about, say, the atom surely do tell us more about atoms, since they are supported by appropriate empirical evidence and are regarded as continually approximating closer to the real nature of the atom, even if there is no guarantee that our knowledge of it will ever be complete. But the absolute is not susceptible to empirical investigation in the way that atoms are. Any empirical evidence we have of the nature of rock-bottom reality can be dismissed by the Kantian skeptic as simply evidence concerning appearances, atoms included, and irrelevant to the nature of the underlying absolute. At this point, Hegel might have conceded that the investigation of successive views of the absolute is simply the best we can do, and that we can never reach the absolute itself. This is not what he does, however. Voy a destacarlo. Contrary to our earlier presupposition, he does not believe that shapes of consciousness proceed indefinitely. They advance towards a goal. The goal, dice Hegel, is fixed for knowledge just as necessarily as the sequence of the advance. It is situated where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself and the concept corresponds to the object and the object to the concept. So the advance towards this goal is also relentless, and no satisfaction is to be found at any earlier station. Me gusta. Estoy seguro que te mojaste, bueno. Cállate, bueno. Generally speaking, each shape of consciousness finds itself to be unsatisfactory and gives way to a more complex and satisfactory shape, which is the truth of its immediate predecessor, not, that is, the truth unqualified. Since this new shape too will find itself unsatisfactory in turn, and what the predecessor really amounts to and what provides a resolution, albeit temporary, of its difficulties. No entiendo la gramática de esa oración. De lo que acabamos de leer. Ah, ya, no, ya cacho. Pero es que la oración larga. Ujú. No era lo que me estás explicando, sí, bueno. Eso sale más arriba. Pero tiene que ver con eso. No es lo que no entendí. No such defective shape of consciousness can reveal the absolute. Not only because of its defects, the mismatch between the object and concept, but also because it is necessary and impossible to go beyond it. No lower shape of consciousness can express the full potential of the absolute generative power. So the final shape of consciousness must be unsurpassable, such that it neither needs to be nor can be supplanted by another shape that amounts to the truth of it. Hegel's presentation of this final shape is two-pronged. It is so because something like a distinction between the phenomenal world and the absolute occurs not only in the minds of fast phenomenological philosophers surveying the successive shapes of consciousness, but also within the shapes of consciousness themselves. This is a distinction between worldly life, the history of which is surveyed in chapter 6, Spirit, and religion, the history of which is recorded is in chapter 7. Religion, as Hegel conceives it, is our shared self-consciousness, in contrast to the consciousness of our worldly life. Since the worldly shapes of consciousness not appear historically in chapter 6 are accompanied by religion, postulating a division between the social world and a relatively determinate absolute. This is true of the Greek world, and especially of the period from the medieval world down to the French Revolution. The history of religions in 7 correlates only very roughly with the history of worldly consciousness in 6, but their final stages neatly coincide. Chapter 6 ends with the beautiful soul, the conscientious individual who forms the basis for the new state that is beginning to emerge in the wake of the French Revolution. In paragraph 658 and onwards, the beautiful soul is presented as a dead end, who has dwindled away because of his inertia. Its reappearance in paragraphs 795 to 7 is a crucial link between earth and heaven. As a crucial link between earth and heaven is surprising and hard to explain. My own explanation is therefore conjectural and controversial. Entonces dice, the chapter 7 ends with the beautiful soul, the conscientious individual who forms the basis of the new state that is beginning to emerge in the wake of the French Revolution. A state that gives due weight both to ethical life, or communal and social morality, and to individual moral conscience, in contrast to the ancient city-state which merged the individual with ethical lives, and to the revolutionary of their absolute freedom, which recognized only the individual citizen, guided, if by anything at all, only by individualistic morality and not by any objective ethical order. The beautiful soul is self-contained and autonomous. In his conscience and in his environing ethical society, he has all the needs for the moral management of his life. He does not need to look to heaven for guidance. Conversely, the concluding stage of religion, Lutheran Christianity, descends to meet the beautiful soul. Christianity is manifest or revealed religion, that is, religion that is entirely open and above board, in which the Absolute discloses itself to mankind. Open and above board, eso no lo entiendo. Un poquito. Above board. If plan or business agreement is above board, it is honest and not trying to deceive anyone. It was completely open and above board. Done in honest according to the rules or law. Conversely, the concluding stage of religion, Lutheran Christianity, descends to meet the beautiful soul. Christianity is 14 el PDF. La mitad. Bueno, no de 15. Bastante después. Bastante después. In his conscience and the beautiful soul is self-contained and autonomous. In his conscience and in his environing ethical society, he has all the needs for the moral management of his life. He does not need to overlook to heaven for guidance. Conversely, the concluding stage of religion, Lutheran Christianity, descends to meet the beautiful soul. Christianity is manifest or revealed religion, that is, the religion that is Christianity is manifest or revealed religion, that is, the religion that is entirely open and above board, in which the Absolute discloses itself to mankind. This is an essential characteristic of God himself. God cannot be God unless he is known to humans, as humans are an essential aspect of God. Laura? Okay. This God religion also provides a gratifying model of the way in which the shapes of our consciousness are involved in the Absolute itself. They are, as it were, rungs of a ladder thrown down to us by God himself, because of his need to be known by us. But this religion brings God down to earth in the form of a man, and subsequently situates him as the Holy Spirit in the Christian community rather than in the remote heaven. God is dead, Hegel proclaims, anticipating Nietzsche, but even anticipated by Lutheran hymnists, and no more intending this dictum as his unequivocal declaration of atheism than they did. Ateísmo, Lutheranismo. Voy a ver qué es hymn. Composer of hymns. Que ya. Conversely, man in the form of the beautiful soul has risen to meet God halfway. In contrast to Descartes and to many another philosopher, Hegel does not regard the self as fixed and determinate, and in particular not as a free-floating ego. It undergoes a transforming education in parallel with the changes in its objects and its attitudes towards them. The phenomenology is, among other things, a quest for an adequate conception of the self. The conscious self is itself an offshoot of the Absolute, and every shape of consciousness involves a conception not only of its object, but also of the self and of its relationship to the object. It does not follow, however, that every shape involves an adequate conception of its own self. In general, an adequate conception of the self or shape N is provided only by its successor, N plus 1, so that knowledge needs to go beyond itself in order to find itself. A shape adequate to the Absolute must provide the self with an adequate account of itself and not leave it to the immediate successive shape to provide such an account. Nota 16. This requirement is attested by observing reason, whose aim is to find itself or the mind in things, whose no account of the world can be complete if it leaves ourselves out. Only after this long education are we in a fit state to fuse with the similarly transformed deity. Thus God becomes man, and conversely man becomes God. The Absolute, Hegel believes, has at last come down to earth. Who am I? This solution, espera un poquito. Yeah. Who am I? This solution may well leave us dissatisfied. For one thing, it gives a disconcertingly parochial account of the humanization of the Absolute. Parochial. It gives a disconcertingly parochial account of the humanization of the Absolute. Why should we regard the religion and the idealized citizen of early 19th century Germany as the appropriate juncture of the revelation of the Absolute? Why should we even accept this religion's account of the Absolute? Secondly, the account misses out Hegel himself. If we accept his assurance that he is simply an onlooker, and that shapes of consciousness are supplied by spirit and not by himself, his own role and his insight into the succession of shapes needs to be explained in terms of the Absolute from which it, like everything else, stems, not shuffled into the unphilosophical beautiful soul. Hegel found a division within himself. Hegel, I raise myself in thought to the Absolute, thus being infinite consciousness, yet at the same time I am finite consciousness. Both aspects seek each other and flee each other. I am the struggle between them. Here we encounter the distinction that Hegel often marks as that between the singular self and the universal self. God is not to be identified with the singular self, with what Kant memorably described as the crude timber of humanity. ¿Qué es eso? Madera torcida. Pero sí, pero... Yeah, but rather with the universal self. God is not to be identified with the singular self, but rather with the universal self. El fuste torcido. A ver. Mira, encontré una web donde hablaban de Kant sobre esto. Kant is saying that humanity is so irregular, this is the one, that you cannot make anything perfectly straight from it. Ya, filo. No sé si esto es lo que se refería. However, we now have two candidates for the role of the universal self: the dutiful, conscientious citizen and the philosopher. Both have a claim to universality. So far as someone is a citizen, he or she, as we might add, even if Hegel would not, is not a singular person, with all the idiosyncrasies that implies, but a rational, dutiful, and morally sensitive performer in a rational social order consisting of similarly exemplary people. Hegel, qua philosopher, is not the singular dance-loving, pie-eating, lottery-playing, wine-drinking Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel described in his biographies, but a pure thinker, whose thoughts might in principle be shared by any similarly gifted individual, and are at some level shared by ungifted individual, and are at some level shared even by ungifted individuals. However, two universal candidates are not one and the same. Hegel was no doubt a conscientious and dutiful citizen, as well as a philosopher, but not every dutiful citizen is a philosopher. This suggests that Hegel might have allowed for a different route in introducing his system to beginners, but might have followed a different route in introducing his system to beginners. Nos soltamos la nota 17, que era una hueá bibliográfica. In the Phenomenology, he proceeds by examining shapes of consciousness which, although they are often suffused with philosophical ideas, are not, for the most part, established philosophical doctrines. In his encyclopedia, by contrast, he presents a briefer alternative introduction, by way of an exposition and critique of various recent philosophies, especially pre-Kantian metaphysics, Leibniz, etc., Hume's empiricism and Kant's transcendental idealism, and Descartes and Jacobi. He sketches an even briefer history of philosophy in paragraph 803 of the Phenomenology, and also remarks in 805 on the fact that shapes of consciousness embody or deploy the general categories that later appear explicitly in the logic. Sensory certainty. Yeah. The plural categories is Aristotle and Kant's word rather than Hegel's. Hegel prefers such terms as thought determinations, Denkbestimmungen. In the Phenomenology he uses Kategorie in the singular and identifies it with the I or self, regarding its differentiation into distinct categories as problematic. What? Sensory certainty, for example, is structured initially at least by the category of being and its successor. Sensory certainty, for example, is structured initially at least by the category of being, and its successor perception is an understanding depend respectively on the category of the thing and its properties, and on such categories as force and law, categories that are applicable both to ourselves and to the things around us. In the shapes of consciousness of the phenomenology, categories are intertwined with empirical material and not considered in their purity. Perception, for example, does not explicitly consider the category of things and properties. It deploys it in order to say that salt is white, cubical, and tart, and to extricate itself from the difficulties this involves. By contrast, when science emerges fully fledged at the end of the book, under the heading Absolute Knowledge, categories are extracted from their empirical embodiment and considered in their purity. This is what Hegel primarily means by saying, in paragraph 77, that the soul purifies itself to spirit. It has broken free of empirical material and deals with pure categories. Liberation from the empirical progresses over the course of the phenomenology. From the empirical. However, Hegel's great philosophical predecessors have only subdued presence in the book as a whole. Why, we might ask, do they and Hegel himself not play a greater part in it? If God has become man, the philosopher has a good acclaim to be in his repository as does the dutiful citizen. Hegel has something to say about this at the very beginning of the Phenomenology, in paragraph 2 of the preface. Philosophies are related to each other in a manner similar to that in which shapes of consciousness are. They form a succession analogous to the gradual growth of a tree. Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Locke, Leibniz, Spinoza, Kant, Hegel. Each of these philosophies, except perhaps the last, is false. And this explains why it is followed by another philosophy. But none of them, or at least none of those that enter the philosophical mainstream, is entirely false. One problem with this conception of philosophy bueno, me hizo pensar a mí que la visión de Hegel el canon no es arbitrario. Estaba en Hegeliana. El Juan llegó hace rato a hablar, parece. Empecé a hacer mi trabajo para el seminario y solo hice el título y el pie así. No estoy iniciando sesión. No estoy iniciando sesión en Twitch. No voy a escribir, no puedo. Pero filo. Entonces dice... One problem with this conception of philosophy is the difficulty of deciding what counts as a philosophy and what does not. Hegel gives short shrift to some of his philosophical contemporaries, such as W. T. Krug and G. Schulze, and romantics such as Friedrich Schlegel, who might be regarded by others as very reputable philosophers. The question is what is to count as philosophy and as significant or great philosophy is itself a philosophical question. Hence different philosophers may well present different histories of their subject. Some figures, Plato, Aristotle, and Kant, for example, will surely appear in any serious history, but the status of others, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Jesus, Saint Paul, is more precarious. Es verdad, weón. Problemón. But none of them, or at least none of those that enter the philosophical mainstream, is entirely false. And that explains why each philosophy retains something of its predecessors. In fact, Hegel tends to regard a philosophy like a shape of consciousness, as the truth of its supplanted predecessor. Though, again, this does not mean that it is the truth, that true, since it will in turn be supplanted by its successor. Not every philosopher has regarded himself as absorbing the thought of his predecessors. Descartes, for example, believed that he was starting from a clean slate, whereas Aristotle explicitly tried to extract and absorb the views of his predecessors insofar as they were correct. There is a similar contrast between Jeremy Bentham, who purported to start afresh, and John Stuart Mill, who wanted to take the best from his predecessors. Hegel more explicitly and deliberately than any of his predecessors attempted to take his predecessors on board, to integrate their findings in what he regards as philosophy, or science, as such, not simply Hegel's philosophy. In the different philosophies that make their appearance, the history of philosophy presents, firstly, only one philosophy at different stages of its development. And secondly, it shows that the particular principles on one of which each system was grounded are only branches of one and the same whole. The last philosophy in time is the result of all preceding philosophies and must therefore contain the principles of all of them. And so, if it's in fact philosophy, it is the fullest, richest, and most concrete philosophy. Oh, weón, qué exigente. The history of philosophy. Taken in isolation, igual brígido porque eso es ultra controversial. ¿Cuál es la filosofía más completa, más rica y más concreta? Yo no conozco ninguna escuela que tenga eso, güey. Igual, a ver qué filósofo consideraría fullest, richest and most concrete. No sé, weón. Soy muy ignorante para eso. Pero todavía no tanto, po, weón. No sé, weón. No sé, weón. Entonces, taking. No, pero ¿dónde digamos? Taken in isolation, each of these preceding philosophies is false, if for no other reason, because they are one-sided, exclusively empiricist, for example, and neglecting the role of reason. This type of falsity is remedied when the philosophy is integrated into a more comprehensive philosophy, one that gives reason as well as experience its due. But in other respects too, a philosophy may need modification because it can be integrated in a later philosophy. Plato's theory of recollection was, for example, adopted by Leibniz for his theory of innate ideas, as shorn of the doctrine of the soul's pre-existence with which Plato associated with it. Plato associated it. Past philosophies undergo similar modifications when they are integrated into Hegel's philosophy. So although, say, Platonism is false on its own, it is no longer false once it is integrated or sublated in Hegelianism. Sure. Why, then, did Hegel not proceed in this way towards fully fledged science, as he did in later works? There are several answers to this question. First, such a procedure may well tell us why, if we are already operating at the level of philosophy, we should advance to Hegelianism and not remain at some earlier stage of philosophy. Then, well, I don't know. What it does not tell us, however, is why we should assent to philosophy in the first place. Yet this is precisely what Hegel wants to explain to his audience. He wants to guide us from the natural consciousness characteristic of philosophers and non-philosophers alike, by way of his own presentation of knowledge as it appears, a sort of knowledge that natural consciousness has, to science. Natural consciousness as knowledge as it appears are distinct from science. They are subject to empirical constraints and are confined, at any given stage of their development, to a particular way of looking at things, the exclusion of other way of looking at things. As science, by contrast, is free of empirical constraints and of such one-sidedness, it incorporates and serves all possible ways of looking at things. In this respect, Hegel's own presentation is akin to, if not already, science. However, it displays the connection of science with non-philosophical communal life, and its history, and its emergence from it. In particular, qué interesante, bueno. In particular, Hegel wants to establish the link between science and religion, and to show how the latter gives rise to the former. The latter, religión, da origen a la ciencia. Brígido. A la ciencia en un sentido súper brígido, exigente y guau. Absolute knowledge. Y la wea. Secondly, if Hegel were simply to proceed from each philosophy to the next, there would be no special reason to suppose that the process ends with Hegel rather than continuing indefinitely to even more advanced philosophies. But Hegel is not content with such a modest position. He regards his own philosophy not as simply one stage in the development of philosophy, but as the culmination of philosophy as such. Bitches. One reason that might be offered for this startling claim is that Hegel, alone among the great philosophers, views philosophy as a single developing organism, each stage of which incorporates and advances on its predecessors. But though that might be a significant innovation, it would surely not be enough to establish that Hegelianism is the full-grown tree, or indeed that there is any limit to the growth of the organism. By contrast, the Phenomenology offers what would be more compelling reasons, if only we could believe them, for accepting the special status of Hegelianism. It alone, among all possible ways of viewing things, leaves no loose ends that need to be tied up by a successor. Alone, with the cooperation of Lutheranism, brings God, and the various versions of the Absolute postulated by its predecessors, down to earth in the form of the logical structure of reality. It alone shows, at long last, that the world is cognitively and morally manageable. But why now? How come al pico weón? Al pico weón. Brígido, sí, big if true. Todo lo que voy a decir. Sí, weón. Puta, justo no hay nadie para ver esta maravilla. Mm, ya. By contrast, the phenomenology of no. Eh, how come that this stupendous climax in the course of the world occurs now in 1806? That is a third advantage that Hegel sees in the procedure he adopts in the phenomenology. It gives an answer to this question that could not be easily be derived simply from Hegel's position in the sequence of great philosophers. His system emerges in a cultural environment involving a confluence of extra-philosophical circumstances, as well as philosophical, especially Lutheranism, and the moral conscience of the Romantics, weon, that are especially favorable to the birth of this new science. Cállate, weón. Cállate. Glory to man in the highest, for man is the master of things. Oh, ¿cómo se dice ocio en inglés? Ocio. Yeah. Hegel is respectful of religion and regards it as an indispensable stepping stone on the road to truth. He is, however, equally respectful of the Enlightenment's criticism of religion. His own criticisms of religion are twofold. First, it postulates heaven with pictorial representations derived from the sensory world, and In the case of Christianity, bases its faith on ill-attested events remote in time and space. Fuhu, brígido. Nota 22. In, in paragraph 554, Hegel suggests that Christianity resorts to historical texts to buttress its faith only because its Enlightenment critics seduce it into doing so, and in paragraph 568, that appeal to such empirical contingencies is only one aspect of Christian faith, as is overemphasized by the Enlightenment. Secondly, entonces, secondly, it splits the universe in two, postulating a sharp rift between the divine world and the human world. Nota 23. Hegel's criticisms apply more incisively to faith, the 18th century target of the Enlightenment's attack, than to religion. For distinction between faith and religion, see 487 and 673. As a consequence, it also divides the human self, at least the religious self, who has one foot planted in heaven and the other on earth. Providentially, however, religion itself, in the form of Lutheranism, supplies the solution, and those loose ends are tied up by philosophy. God has become man, or conversely, man has become God. The man in question, however, the universal man, whether this be dutiful citizen or the all-seeing philosopher. Moreover, the man in question has not simply cast aside his past history. The shapes of consciousness that Hegel surveys are familiar to this man, and they constitute his substance. See paragraph 30. He has a Greek, Roman, and medieval Catholic, an enlightened philosophe, a French revolutionary, and a conscientious moralist packed within him. Pero well, Michael. Dirigido, ya. ¿Sigamos? Hence Hegel's humanism, if such it be, does not stand in stark contrast to theism, but is conceived as a development of it, and preserves as well as abolishes its religious origin. Nota 24. That is, it translates to them. Such a humanism is not, however, immovably rooted in its parochial birthplace. Lutheranism and the Beautiful Soul explain in Hegel's view how it came to birth, but it may well appeal to many who are not 19th century German Lutherans. Hegel's humanism, or as we might better call it, is theanthropism. ¿Qué pasó? Theanthropism did not remain parochial. It is, however, thoroughly anthropocentric. An important strand in Hegel's argument is this: in Kant's usage, as we have seen, things in themselves, Dinge an sich, are things that as they are intrinsically, independently of us, independently in fact of anything else. We cannot know things as they are in themselves, but only as they appear to us. Mediated and distorted by our cognitive equipment, our knowledge is less than fully satisfactory. Indeed, in paragraph 75, Hegel doubts whether such so-called knowledge is really knowledge at all. He, by contrast, confers another meaning on an sich. Something is an sich is something that is an sich is merely potential, not fully actual, not for itself, let alone in and for itself. Hegel is here influenced by Aristotle's distinction between what is dunamei, potential, and what is energeiai, actual. If things in themselves are taken in this sense, then it is the things that are defective merely potential rather than our own knowledge. When we come to know them, we do not distort them, we actualize them, and we make them into what they really are. This is why God is not properly God unless he is known by man. To reach this conclusion, however, Hegel must already confer a special status on man and also on knowledge. We might well agree that to be properly actual, a thing must enter into relations with other things. It is hard to conceive of anything existing even in a potential form if it is wholly unrelated to everything else. Even an acorn, a merely potential oak tree, is related to other entities. To realize its potential and become an actual tree, it needs to enter into closer relations with soil, water, sunlight, and so on. But it does not need to be known by man. Why should it be otherwise with God? No doubt God was a barely comprehensible state of sheer potentiality before he created the world. 26. Hegel is at odds with the Christian tradition, which regards God as wholly actual even before the creation. No doubt God was in a barely comprehensive state of sheer potentiality before he created the world, but his relationship to a world, even a world bereft of human knowers, should surely be enough to actualize them. In religious terms, Hegel's answer is that God is a spirit, that to be fully actualized, spirit must be self-conscious, know itself, and that God can only become self-conscious in virtue of being known by humans. It is not enough that they should love him and worship him. They must know him inside and out. In more secular terms, Hegel's worldview is thoroughly anthropocentric. Humankind is not simply one among many other species, perched precariously above their physical, organic, and animal levels of nature. Not only we are the highest creatures the universe contains, no, de una chica. Characterization, si no, está hardcore lo que el contenido, bueno. The characterization of humanity as the highest creature is itself anthropocentric, but no other creature has any say in the matter. A justification of it might be that humans involve the other levels of nature, physical, organic, and animal, but also something extra, namely rationality and all that goes with it. Not only are we the highest creatures in the universe contains, thinks Hegel, it is we who confer meaning and value on the universe and above all bring to it the self-knowledge, knowledge of the universe as a whole. It is only for us that the question of the knowability of the absolute arises as a problem at all. That there is, as far as we know, nothing else that asks the question, what is the absolute? Nothing else from... Y las preguntas filosóficas que nos hacemos en general, la otra especie se parecen enfrentar eso de manera mucho más rudimentaria a los problemas filosóficos, a los problemas que motivan a la filosofía. Como que tienen una... son súper distintos, bueno. No es por ser antropocentrista para la weá, pero puta, weón. Súper distinto, weón. Cállate, weón. Solo estaba comentando el texto, no tanto lo que decía. Cállate. Aroli, y entonces, ¿dónde vamos? 27. What is as far as we know, nothing else that asks the question that what is the absolute? Nothing else from which the absolute is hidden, since there is nothing else to which it could possibly reveal. It does not follow from this that our answer to the question should be as anthropocentric as the question itself. Hegel's justification for this step is perhaps twofold. First, whatever else the absolute may be, it must at least be sufficient to generate the human spirit, and the succession of shapes of consciousness in which it gradually unfolds. In Hegel's eyes, this implies that the absolute is itself a spirit. Secondly, the culmination of the onward march of the human spirit is the final completion of a logical system that is not only the underpinning of human thought, but in Hegel's view, the logical structure of the universe itself. In theological terms, God's plan for the creation of the world is mirrored in the depths of the human mind and becomes fully explicit in that mind. Thanks to ourselves, God becomes aware of what we had in mind all along. What he had in mind all along. Partido 28, nota 28. Apart from Hegel's reluctance to admit that anything is incomprehensible, there is more than a remote analogy between his attitude to theism and that expressed in Hume. 2008, page 120, says Hume, I ask the theist if he does not allow that there is a great and immeasurable, thus incomprehensible difference between the human and the divine mind. The more pious he is, the more readily will he assent to the affirmative, and the more he will be disposed to magnify the difference. He will even assert that the difference is of a nature which cannot be too much magnified. I next turn to the atheist, who I assert is only nominally so, and can never possibly be in earnest, and I ask him whether, from the coherence and apparent sympathy in all the parts of this world, there be not a certain degree of analogy among all the operations of nature, in every situation and in every age, whether the rotting of a turnip, the generation of an animal, and the structure of human thought, denote energies that probably bear some remote analogy to each other. It is impossible he can deny it. He will readily acknowledge it. Having obtained this concession, I push him still farther in his retreat, and I ask him, if it be not probable, that the principle which first arranged and still maintains order in this universe bears not also some remote inconceivable analogy to the other operations of nature, and among the rest of the economy of human mind and thought. However reluctant, he must keep his assent. Where then cry above his antagonists is the subject of your dispute. Theist allows that the original intelligence is very different from human reason. The atheist allows that the original principle of order bears some remote analogy to it. Will you quarrel, gentlemen, about degrees and enter into a controversy which admits not of any precise meaning, nor consequently of any determination? Oh, qué wea, Hume, la mea volada, weón, qué wea, loco, estoy contigo, weón, qué wea. La mea volada, weón, la mea volada, weón, qué wea tiene en la cabeza, weón. Esta wea está más loco que la chucha, weón, qué wea, weón. Hegel's humanism differs from the humanism of the Enlightenment in several respects. It does not stand in sharp contrast to theism. The new man God is laden with his religious past. It is not open to the charge that it postulates a uniform and unchanging human nature. Man has not always been God. He has laboriously developed in order to become God. It is not so thoroughly egalitarian as the Enlightenment version. Not everyone is a philosopher or even a politically active citizen. Here Hegel's collectivism comes into play. Peasants, as well as philosophers, play a part in the social order, and they are elevated to divinity along with the rest. Quite likely religious worship will continue in order to give them a glimpse of the absolute. Bueno, qué guay. Hegel proclaims the end of art, but never the end of religion. Chucha. El pico. Sí, proclaim the end of art, pues, weón. Qué weá, hermano. Why? Hegel's humanism is a curious beast. Sí. Notes on relational commentary by Hegel, weón, la concha de su madre. Y el prefacio no se lee, entonces no es la página, el prefacio no se lee de Hegel, sino que se lee la introducción.